He thought one rude phone call would remind a waitress of her place, but within the next hour, he would discover that true respect is never demanded by power because it is earned through character. The dinner rush had barely begun when the first ring shattered the comfortable rhythm inside Harper's Diner, a family-owned restaurant tucked beside a busy highway just outside downtown Chicago. Coffee steamed behind the counter, bacon sizzled across the grill, and the familiar hum of conversations blended with old country music drifting softly from a dusty radio above the kitchen door. Emily Brooks balanced 3 plates along one arm with the effortless confidence that came only after years of serving customers through every kind of morning and every kind of mood. At 28 years old, she had learned that a smile often solved problems before words ever could. She greeted every customer by looking them in the eye, remembered regular orders without writing them down, and treated every guest with the same quiet respect whether they tipped generously or barely left enough change to cover the tax. As she placed fresh coffee in front of an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, the restaurant telephone rang again. Her manager, overwhelmed with a delivery at the back entrance, called for Emily to answer it. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron before picking up the receiver. Harper's Diner, this is Emily speaking. How may I help you today? A man's voice answered immediately, sharp enough to cut through the noise of the busy restaurant. Finally, do people there always move this slowly, or am I just unlucky today? Emily remained calm. I apologize for your wait, sir. How may I assist you? Instead of responding to her question, the caller sighed with obvious irritation. I need a private table in exactly 20 minutes. Make sure no one bothers me. Tell your kitchen, I do not tolerate mistakes, and if my food is not perfect, someone will be looking for another job. Emily glanced toward the crowded dining room. Every booth was occupied, and families continued entering through the front door. I am sorry, sir, she answered politely. We do not accept reservations during peak hours, but we would be happy to seat you as soon as a table becomes available. The silence on the other end lasted only a heartbeat before the man's tone became even colder. Do you know who you are talking to? Emily had heard that question before from customers who believed titles mattered more than kindness. Her answer never changed. I know I am speaking to someone who deserves respectful service, sir, and I hope you'll extend that same respect to our staff. A short laugh echoed through the receiver, though there was no humor in it. You are a waitress. Your job is to listen, not to lecture. Several nearby customers looked toward Emily after hearing the raised voice through the phone. She noticed a young busboy quietly freeze beside the drink station, clearly uncomfortable. Emily lowered her voice even further, refusing to match the caller's anger. Sir, I will gladly help you if we can speak respectfully to one another. You do not make the rules, the man replied. You do what you are told. Emily closed her eyes for the briefest moment. She had spent years protecting younger coworkers from customers who believed being rude was a privilege that came with money. She would not allow it today. Then I am afraid I cannot continue this conversation, she said with unwavering professionalism. When you are ready to speak respectfully, we will be happy to serve you. Have a good afternoon. Before the man could answer, she gently placed the receiver back onto its cradle. The restaurant grew unusually quiet for a few seconds before life returned to normal. Emily simply took a slow breath, picked up another pot of fresh coffee, and continued serving guests as though nothing unusual had happened. She had no idea that the caller she had just disconnected was Ethan Park, one of the most influential Korean Mafia bosses in the country, a man whose name caused seasoned executives to choose their words carefully. 12 minutes later, the low rumble of powerful engines rolled across the diner parking lot. One after another, 10 identical black luxury SUVs turned off the highway and lined up in perfect formation outside Harper's Diner. Every conversation inside the restaurant stopped. Forks froze halfway to plates. Coffee cups remained suspended in midair. Even the cook stepped away from the grill to look through the front window. Emily slowly followed everyone's gaze toward the entrance, unaware that the simple decision she had made to defend basic respect was about to change far more than just her workday. The deep growl of idling engines settled over the parking lot like an approaching storm, yet inside Harper's Diner, no one dared move toward the front door. Through the wide glass windows, customers watched as sharply dressed drivers stepped out of each black sport utility vehicle and quietly took their positions with disciplined precision. There was no shouting, no rushed movement, only an unmistakable presence that commanded attention without saying a word. Emily looked from the window to her manager, Frank Dawson, whose face had lost nearly all its color. He wiped his hands nervously on a kitchen towel before whispering, "Please tell me you did not just hang up on one of them." Emily answered honestly, "I ended the call because he refused to speak respectfully to our staff." Frank closed his eyes for a brief moment, clearly imagining every possible consequence. "Emily, you have always been one of my best employees, but if those people are here because of that phone call, I do not know how I can protect this place." Emily gave him a calm look that carried neither fear nor regret. "You should not have to protect me for asking someone to be respectful." Around them, the dining room filled with anxious whispers. A young mother quietly guided her children closer to their booth. Two truck drivers near the counter exchanged uncertain glances before setting down their coffee cups. Even the regular customers who had visited Harper's Diner every morning for years had never seen anything like this. The front door finally opened with a soft chime instead of the dramatic entrance everyone had imagined. A tall man wearing a perfectly tailored black suit stepped inside with measured confidence. His polished shoes made almost no sound against the clean tile floor. Behind him, several equally well-dressed associates remained near the entrance without speaking, allowing him to walk forward alone. Ethan Park slowly surveyed the restaurant. His expression remained composed, revealing neither anger nor satisfaction. His eyes eventually settled on Emily behind the counter. Frank hurried forward before Ethan could speak. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for anything that may have happened. If there has been a misunderstanding, I accept full responsibility as the manager." Ethan looked at him politely before answering in a calm voice, "I did not come to speak with the manager." His attention returned to Emily. Every person inside the diner seemed to stop breathing. Frank stepped aside reluctantly, while Emily quietly placed the coffee pot back onto the warmer and walked toward the front counter. Her hands remained steady. Her shoulders remained relaxed. She refused to let nervousness change the way she carried herself. Standing only a few feet away, Ethan studied her for several silent seconds. There was no hostility in her eyes, only quiet professionalism. Finally, he spoke. "Were you the one who ended our phone conversation?" Emily met his gaze, without arrogance. "Yes, sir." "Do you usually disconnect customers?" he asked. "Only when the conversation stops being respectful," she replied gently. Another long silence followed. Customers watched every expression, trying to predict what would happen next. Ethan folded his hands in front of him. "Do you realize that most people would never dare speak to me the way you did?" Emily answered with complete honesty.
"No, sir."
"I spoke to you the way I believe every person deserves to be spoken to. Calmly and respectfully. I simply expected the same in return." Those words lingered in the quiet restaurant. Ethan did not immediately respond. Instead, he glanced around the dining room, noticing elderly couples, families, hardworking travelers, and tired employees continuing to wait despite the unusual interruption. Then he looked back at Emily, whose expression had not changed. She was prepared to accept whatever came next, but she would not apologize for defending the dignity of the people beside her. For the first time that day, Ethan felt something unfamiliar interrupt the certainty that had guided him for years. It was not anger. It was curiosity. Curiosity settled over the diner more heavily than fear ever could. Ethan Park had built a reputation that caused people to lower their voices the moment his name entered a room, yet the woman standing before him seemed interested only in treating him the same way she treated everyone else. She neither challenged him nor attempted to impress him. She simply waited, allowing him the dignity of choosing what kind of person he wished to be next. After another long moment, Ethan spoke quietly. "What is your name?" "Emily Brooks, sir." He nodded once. "Emily Brooks, I expected an apology when I walked through that door." Emily answered without hesitation. "I would apologize if I had been disrespectful. I do not believe I was." Several customers exchanged nervous glances. Frank silently closed his eyes again, convinced the conversation had reached its breaking point. Instead, Ethan asked another question. What makes you think you have the right to decide when a customer crosses the line? Emily looked toward the young busboy who had frozen beside the drink station earlier. The teenager was pretending to refill napkin dispensers while quietly listening. Because he should never have to believe that being yelled at is part of earning an honest paycheck, she replied. Neither should anyone else working here. Ethan followed her gaze and noticed the young employee immediately look away. For the first time, he realized Emily had never been defending herself. She had been protecting someone standing behind her. That distinction lingered in his thoughts. Without another word, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card before placing it gently on the counter. If you ever change your mind about our conversation, call me. Emily looked down but made no attempt to pick it up. Thank you, sir, but I do not think either of us needs another argument today. Ethan allowed the smallest hint of a smile to appear before turning toward the entrance. His associates immediately stepped aside as he walked out, leaving the restaurant exactly as quietly as he had entered. One by one, the black sport utility vehicles pulled away until only the ordinary sounds of afternoon traffic remained. The tension inside Harper's Diner slowly dissolved, replaced by confused conversations that spread across nearly every table. Frank hurried toward Emily. I cannot believe that just happened. Emily picked up the business card and handed it to him instead. Neither can I. Do you know who he really is? Frank asked. Emily nodded softly. I know enough. Then why were you not afraid? Emily looked around the diner where the elderly couple had resumed sharing dessert. The truck drivers laughed again over fresh coffee, and the young busboy finally relaxed enough to smile. Because if I let fear decide how I treat people, I would become the same kind of person I was asking him not to be. Those words stayed with Frank long after the afternoon crowd disappeared. Across the city, Ethan sat silently in the back seat of his vehicle while the skyline passed beyond tinted windows. His senior advisor finally broke the silence. Should we investigate her? Ethan kept watching the passing streets. Yes. The advisor immediately reached for his tablet. Background check. Ethan slowly shook his head. No. I already know enough about her employment history. He paused before adding, find out who she is when no one is watching. The request surprised everyone inside the vehicle. Ethan had spent years investigating competitors, business partners, and potential threats. Never before had he shown genuine curiosity about an ordinary waitress. Yet something about Emily's calm refusal to surrender her principles refused to leave his mind. For the first time in many years, he was no longer interested in proving someone wrong. He wanted to discover why someone with so little authority carried herself with more quiet confidence than many of the powerful people he met every day. The report arrived on Ethan Park's desk before sunrise the following morning, neatly organized inside a simple gray folder that looked no different from hundreds of others he had reviewed over the years. Yet this one remained unopened for several minutes as sunlight slowly filled his office overlooking the city. His senior advisor finally spoke. We found everything you requested. Ethan reached for the folder but paused before opening it. Tell me only what cannot be found on official records. The advisor nodded. Emily Brooks has worked at Harper's Diner for nearly 6 years. She has never received a complaint from management. Her neighbors describe her as dependable. She lives in a modest apartment with her mother, who requires ongoing medical care. Every Tuesday and Thursday after finishing her shift at the diner, she spends several hours volunteering at a neighborhood community center without accepting compensation. Ethan remained silent. Continue. She occasionally leaves food at the front doors of elderly residents who struggle to leave their homes. She also quietly pays for meals when families come up short at the diner. She always asks the cashier not to mention her name. Ethan slowly closed the folder without reading another page. Who told you this? No one directly, the advisor answered. We spoke with people around the neighborhood. None of them knew they were describing the same person. That answer lingered in the room. Genuine kindness rarely announced itself. It simply appeared wherever it was needed and disappeared before anyone could applaud it. Later that afternoon, Ethan instructed his driver to take an unfamiliar route through the city. Instead of traveling with multiple vehicles, he chose a single unmarked sedan. He did not want anyone preparing for his arrival. From across the street, he quietly watched Harper's Diner through the large front windows. The lunch crowd kept every table occupied. Emily moved from booth to booth with the same steady patience she had shown the previous day. She laughed with an elderly couple celebrating another wedding anniversary. She carefully knelt beside a young boy to hand him a coloring page after noticing his parents looked exhausted. She carried extra napkins before customers realized they needed them. None of these gestures appeared extraordinary by themselves. Together, however, they revealed something far more meaningful. She treated every person as though their day mattered. As the afternoon slowed, Ethan noticed an elderly man enter the diner, wearing worn work clothes. He quietly counted the bills inside his wallet before ordering only a bowl of soup and a glass of water. Emily greeted him warmly, then disappeared into the kitchen for a few moments. When she returned, she placed a full sandwich beside the soup with an easy smile. The man immediately reached for his wallet again. Emily gently shook her head. "The kitchen prepared a little extra today," she said kindly. "We would hate to let good food go to waste." The grateful customer smiled with quiet relief, never realizing she had personally paid the difference before bringing out the meal. Ethan watched everything from inside the parked car without interruption. No cameras followed Emily. No one praised her. She behaved exactly the same way when she believed nobody important was watching. His driver finally broke the silence. "Sir, should we leave?" Ethan continued looking through the diner window as Emily helped the young busboy carry a heavy tray, thanking him afterward as though he had done her the favor instead. Ethan slowly answered, almost to himself. Most people become kinder when they know they are being observed. She becomes exactly the same person whether anyone notices or not. For reasons he could not yet fully explain, that realization unsettled him more deeply than any business negotiation or display of power ever had. The woman who had calmly ended his phone call had unknowingly begun challenging something far greater than his authority. She had begun challenging the way he measured the value of another human being. 2 days passed before Ethan Park returned to Harper's Diner, but this time there were no black sport utility vehicles, no tailored entourage waiting outside, and no announcement of his arrival. He drove himself in a modest sedan that blended easily into the afternoon traffic and parked several spaces away from the entrance. Wearing a simple charcoal jacket over an open-collar shirt instead of his usual custom suit, he stepped inside carrying nothing except quiet curiosity. The familiar chime above the door rang softly, and no one looked up with alarm because no one recognized him immediately. The diner buzzed with ordinary life. Fresh coffee filled the air, conversations drifted comfortably between booths, and sunlight poured through the windows, warming the polished wooden tables. Emily was refilling a customer's iced tea when she noticed the new guest waiting patiently near the entrance. She smiled exactly as she had smiled at every other customer that afternoon. "Welcome. You may choose any available table by the window if you would like." There was no hesitation in her voice and no trace of the tension from their previous encounter. Ethan quietly thanked her and took the seat she suggested. He watched as she continued serving everyone in the dining room with the same steady rhythm he had observed from across the street. She remembered names, asked about an elderly customer's recent medical appointment, congratulated a college student on passing an important exam, and thanked every coworker who helped carry dishes from the kitchen. Nothing appeared rehearsed. Kindness simply seemed to be the language she spoke most naturally. When she approached his table with a menu, she recognized him almost immediately. Her expression changed only enough to acknowledge that recognition before returning to calm professionalism. "Good afternoon, Mr. Park," she said gently. "I hope today has been treating you well." Ethan looked up, surprised that she addressed him with the same courtesy she offered everyone else. "You are not surprised to see me?" Emily smiled politely. "I have learned that every customer deserves another chance to begin a conversation." Those words settled over the table more deeply than she realized. Ethan ordered a simple cheeseburger, fries, and black coffee, choosing the same meal several truck drivers nearby were enjoying. Emily wrote nothing down, repeating the order from memory before heading toward the kitchen. Throughout the meal, Ethan paid close attention. She never hurried customers who lingered over coffee. She quietly replaced a dropped fork before anyone had to ask. When a tired father apologized because his toddler accidentally spilled orange juice across the table, Emily laughed softly, reassured him that accidents happened every day, and returned moments later with fresh drinks at no additional charge. There was no performance in any of it. It was simply who she was. After finishing his meal, Ethan placed his cup carefully onto the saucer. Emily returned with a check, but before she could set it down, he asked, "May I ask you something personal?" She nodded cautiously. "You may ask." Ethan folded his hands. "Why do you continue treating difficult people kindly when they have not earned it?" Emily thought for only a moment before answering. "Respect is not a reward that I hand out only to pleasant people. It is a choice about the kind of person I want to become. Someone else's behavior should not decide my character." Ethan remained silent as those words echoed through his thoughts. For years he had believed respect belonged to those who possessed influence, wealth, or authority. Sitting inside a small roadside diner, he realized that the woman standing across from him understood something he had never truly learned. Respect did not begin with power. It began with the decision to offer dignity before expecting it in return. The conversation lingered in Ethan Park's mind long after he left Harper's Diner. Throughout the following week, he found himself measuring every interaction against the quiet standard Emily Brooks had described. During executive meetings, he noticed assistants standing silently along the walls while powerful people spoke over them without acknowledgement. At expensive restaurants, he observed wealthy patrons thanking one another while barely looking at the servers refilling their glasses. For years he had accepted those moments as ordinary. Now they seemed impossible to ignore. One Friday afternoon, Ethan returned to Harper's Diner once again, this time during the busiest hour of the week. The familiar bell above the entrance rang, and several regular customers greeted Emily by name before she welcomed them to their usual tables. She noticed Ethan almost immediately and offered the same warm smile she had shared with every guest who walked through the door. "Good afternoon, Mr. Park. It is nice to see you again." Ethan nodded. "I was hoping you would have a table available. For someone willing to wait patiently, we always find one," she replied with gentle humor. He laughed quietly, surprising even himself. While waiting near the entrance, Ethan watched Emily calmly help a new employee who accidentally entered the wrong order into the register. Instead of criticizing the young cashier in front of customers, Emily patiently showed her how to correct the mistake before thanking her for asking for help. The frightened expression on the new employee's face slowly turned into relief. Ethan realized that leadership could exist without titles, expensive offices, or authority. Sometimes it appeared through simple kindness offered at exactly the right moment. A few minutes later, Emily served Ethan at a small booth near the window. As he finished his lunch, Frank approached the table carrying the check, but Ethan politely asked if he could speak with everyone before leaving. Curious glances spread throughout the diner as Frank rang the small brass bell normally used to announce birthdays. Conversations gradually faded until the dining room became completely still. Ethan slowly stood, looking first toward Frank, then toward the kitchen staff, the cashiers, the busboys, and finally Emily. "A week ago, I walked into this diner believing I had come here because someone had disrespected me," he began calmly. "The truth is much simpler. I came here because I had forgotten what respect actually looks like." No one interrupted. Every eye remained fixed on him. Ethan turned toward Emily. "Miss Brooks, when you ended our phone conversation, I believed you had embarrassed me. Instead, you reminded me that courtesy cannot be demanded through position or reputation. It must begin with the person asking for it." Emily looked genuinely surprised, saying nothing as Ethan continued. "I owe you an apology." The words settled over the room with remarkable silence. "I spoke to you as though your profession determined your worth. I was wrong. You treated me with more dignity than I offered you, even when I gave you every reason not to." Several customers quietly lowered their eyes. Frank folded his arms, visibly moved. Ethan reached into his jacket and placed a small envelope on the counter. Emily looked at it but did not touch it. "There is no contract inside," Ethan explained with a faint smile. "No business proposal.
No obligación.
It is simply a donation to the community center where you volunteer every week, made in honor of the example you have set. They told me you never wanted recognition, so the contribution will remain anonymous unless they ask why it arrived." Emily's eyes softened with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said gently. "Not for the donation, but for listening." Ethan nodded.
No.
"Thank you for teaching me." As he walked toward the exit, the diner remained unusually quiet until one customer began to applaud. Another followed, then another, until the entire room filled with warm applause directed not toward wealth or influence, but toward a waitress whose greatest strength had always been the simple courage to treat every human being with equal dignity. And as the afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, Ethan understood that the most valuable lesson he had learned had not been found inside a boardroom or behind the walls of power. It had been waiting all along inside a small roadside diner, served with a cup of coffee and unwavering respect. The applause gradually faded, but the atmosphere inside Harper's diner never fully returned to what it had been before. Something invisible had shifted. Customers who had witnessed Ethan Park's apology continued talking about it in quiet voices as they finished their meals. Some smiled at Emily with renewed admiration, while others simply thanked her a little more sincerely than they had before. Emily accepted every compliment with the same modest smile she had always worn, then returned to clearing tables and refilling coffee cups as though nothing extraordinary had happened. To her, there were still customers waiting, dishes to carry, and co-workers who depended on one another. Later that evening, after the last guests had left and the chairs had been placed upside down on the tables, Frank found Emily wiping down the front counter. He leaned against the register with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said quietly, "most people would have tried to use today to change their lives." Emily folded the cleaning cloth neatly before answering. "My life already changed the moment I realized I did not have to become unkind just because someone else was." Frank smiled. "That may be the wisest thing anyone has ever said inside this diner." Emily laughed softly and continued cleaning. Across the city, Ethan sat alone in his office overlooking the lights of Chicago. The envelope he had prepared for the community center had been accepted, yet the conversation with Emily continued echoing in his thoughts. His advisor entered carrying several documents requiring immediate signatures. Ethan reviewed them carefully before stopping at one contract involving a service company. He noticed language that allowed unreasonable financial penalties for small employee mistakes. Only weeks earlier, he would have signed it without another thought. Instead, he placed the contract aside. "Rewrite this section," he instructed calmly. "No employee should lose a month's wages over a simple error." His advisor looked surprised but nodded. Throughout the following days, similar moments continued appearing. Receptionists were thanked instead of ignored. Junior employees found their opinions being requested during meetings. Maintenance staff received personal acknowledgement instead of passing invisibly through the hallways. None of these changes made headlines. They did not attract television cameras or public praise. Yet people inside Ethan's organization quietly noticed that something had changed in the man whose approval they had once feared more than respected. Meanwhile, Harper's Diner continued welcoming travelers from every corner of the country. One rainy afternoon, the young busboy who had once frozen in fear during that unforgettable phone call approached Emily while drying silverware. "Can I ask you something?" Emily nodded. "Of course." He hesitated before speaking. "Were you scared that day?" Emily smiled honestly. "Yes." The answer surprised him. "You were?" "Very much." He looked confused. "Then why did you still stand up to him?" Emily rested a stack of clean menus on the counter before answering. "Because courage is not the absence of fear. Sometimes courage is simply deciding that another person's dignity matters more than your own comfort." The young employee quietly absorbed those words. They stayed with him long after his shift ended. Several weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at the diner addressed to Emily. There was no company logo, no expensive stationery, and no signature beyond a single first name. Inside, only one sentence had been written in careful handwriting. Thank you for reminding me that authority may open doors, but humility is what allows people to walk through them together. Ethan. Emily folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the small recipe book she carried every day, not because it came from someone powerful, but because it represented something far more valuable. It proved that even a brief moment of honesty, offered without anger and received with an open heart, could quietly reshape a life. As evening settled outside the diner windows and another ordinary day came to an end, Emily switched off the dining room lights, knowing tomorrow would likely look much like today. Customers would arrive hungry, coffee would be poured, conversations would begin, and kindness would once again cost nothing while remaining the richest thing anyone could offer. The weeks that followed quietly transformed more lives than either Emily Brooks or Ethan Park could have imagined. Harper's Diner remained the same welcoming place beside the highway, but stories about the small restaurant began spreading from customer to customer. Truck drivers mentioned the waitress who remembered everyone's name. Families recommended the diner because every guest felt genuinely welcome. Traveling salespeople returned simply because someone there made an ordinary meal feel meaningful. Emily never noticed the growing reputation. She continued arriving before sunrise, tying on the same blue apron, brewing the first pot of coffee, and greeting every coworker with the same warm smile that had become part of the restaurant itself. One cool autumn afternoon, the community center where Emily volunteered organized a neighborhood appreciation event for local families. Children decorated handmade posters while senior citizens prepared homemade desserts for everyone attending. Emily spent the afternoon arranging folding chairs, serving lemonade, and helping young volunteers set up activity tables. She believed it would be another quiet gathering among neighbors. She had no idea another unexpected guest had arrived. Ethan Park stepped from a modest sedan parked across the street, dressed as simply as he had during his recent visits to the diner. He carried no assistants, no security detail, and no public announcement. Only a small cardboard box rested in his hands. Inside were new books, educational games, and school supplies requested by the community center months earlier, but never purchased because funding had fallen short. The center director welcomed him with polite surprise before quietly accepting the donation. "Would you like us to announce your generosity?" she asked. Ethan smiled and gently shook his head. "Please thank everyone who supports this place every week. That includes me today." Emily noticed him only after helping a little girl finish painting a paper butterfly. She walked over with genuine surprise. "Mr. Park, I did not expect to see you here." Ethan looked around the busy room where children laughed beside grandparents and volunteers worked without seeking attention. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I wanted to understand why you keep coming here after working long shifts." Emily glanced toward a group of children reading together in one corner. "Because everyone deserves someone who believes they matter." Ethan followed her gaze. "You say simple things that somehow become difficult to forget." Before Emily could answer, a young boy accidentally knocked over a container filled with colored pencils, sending dozens rolling across the polished floor. Several children immediately bent down to gather them. Without hesitation, Ethan knelt beside them and began collecting pencils as well. The children smiled, unaware of his reputation or influence. To them, he was simply another adult willing to help. Emily quietly watched the scene unfold. There was no audience applauding him, no business advantage waiting at the end of the gesture, and no expectation of recognition. He simply helped because it was needed. When the last pencil had been returned to its container, the little boy looked up and said, "Thank you, mister." Ethan smiled warmly. "You are very welcome." As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the community center windows, Emily noticed something different in the man standing beside her. The confidence remained, but it no longer demanded attention. It created comfort instead. Before leaving, Ethan turned toward Emily. "I spent years believing that influence meant changing large numbers of people all at once." He looked around the room one final time. "Now, I think real influence begins by changing the way one person feels after meeting you." Emily smiled softly. "That change has a way of traveling farther than we ever expect." Ethan nodded in quiet agreement before walking toward the exit, leaving behind only a few anonymous boxes of supplies and a room that felt just a little brighter because someone had finally learned that the greatest acts of leadership often begin with the smallest acts of humility. Nearly a year passed, and Harper's Diner continued standing beside the highway exactly as it always had, proving that the most meaningful stories rarely end with dramatic change, but with ordinary days lived differently. The familiar bell above the entrance still welcomed travelers escaping long miles on the road. The smell of fresh coffee still drifted through the dining room before sunrise, and Emily Brooks still tied on the same blue apron before greeting every customer with genuine warmth. She had received several job offers after people heard about her remarkable character, including opportunities that promised larger paychecks and impressive titles. She thanked every employer sincerely before choosing to remain exactly where she believed she could make the greatest difference. Frank often joked that the diner would never survive without her, but Emily always smiled and reminded him that every person working there mattered equally. Across the city, Ethan Park quietly continued, transforming the culture within his organization. New managers attended leadership workshops centered on respect, listening, and personal accountability rather than intimidation. Employee recognition programs celebrated honesty, teamwork, and service instead of status alone. Receptionists, maintenance workers, drivers, and assistants discovered their opinions were genuinely welcomed during meetings that once belonged only to executives. The changes spread gradually, almost invisibly, yet the atmosphere inside the company became noticeably different. People worked with greater confidence because they felt seen rather than merely supervised. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan drove back to Harper's Diner without announcing his visit. Emily recognized him immediately and smiled as she poured a fresh cup of black coffee before he even reached his favorite booth near the window. "Welcome back," she said warmly. "It has been a while." Ethan looked around the familiar room before answering. "I wanted to visit the place where everything started." Emily laughed softly. "It all started with one difficult phone call." Ethan smiled.
No.
"It started because someone refused to believe that kindness should depend on who was standing in front of them." They spoke for only a few minutes before the morning rush demanded Emily's attention again. As she walked away to greet a family entering through the front door, Ethan noticed the young busboy from months earlier confidently training 2 new employees. He smiled patiently as he explained how every guest should be welcomed. Nearby, the new cashier thanked a customer by name before wishing her a safe drive home. None of them realized they were repeating lessons first demonstrated by a quiet waitress who had simply chosen respect over fear. Before leaving, Ethan placed enough money on the table to cover breakfast and an unusually generous tip. Beneath the receipt, he wrote one final handwritten note. "The strongest people are not remembered because others feared them. They are remembered because others became better after meeting them. Thank you for changing my definition of strength." Emily found the note only after he had already driven away. She folded it carefully beside the earlier letter inside her recipe book, then returned to serving coffee exactly as she always had. Outside, the morning sun reflected across the diner windows while traffic flowed steadily along the highway. Thousands of strangers would pass that little restaurant without ever knowing a simple conversation inside had quietly changed countless lives beyond its walls. Yet perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. The world rarely changes through grand speeches or displays of power. Sometimes it changes because one ordinary person chooses dignity when disrespect would have been easier, and another person has the humility to learn from that example. Harper's Diner remained just another roadside restaurant to passing travelers, but to those whose lives had intersected there, it became a quiet reminder that every title eventually fades, every position is temporary, and every reputation can be rewritten. Only the way people make one another feel continues traveling long after they have gone. And on that quiet stretch of highway, where coffee was poured with care and every guest was welcomed with the same sincere smile, the true measure of greatness was no longer power, wealth, or influence. It was the simple decision to honor the dignity that already existed within every human being.